The road to Merrick Hollow was not on any map, at least not anymore. Locals said the forest had a way of swallowing paths, that once the trees decided you shouldn't find something, you never would. Yet Clara Vane found it, guided by the brittle directions written on a slip of paper she swore hadn't been in her bag that morning. By dusk, she stood before the ruin that had once been the Merrick estate, a sprawling manor with its windows blackened like blind eyes and its chimneys leaning as though exhaling the last breath of something that didn't want to die. The forest seemed to thicken the deeper Clara drove, the asphalt giving way to gravel, then to dirt, and finally to something that wasn't a road at all, just a path carved by time and neglect. The trees pressed close on either side, their branches reaching over the hood of her car like fingers eager to pull her in. The GPS had lost signal miles ago, and the radio had long fallen silent, broken only by the occasional hiss of static that almost sounded like breathing. She kept the window cracked despite the cold, listening to the world around her, to the stillness that didn't feel empty but watchful. It was as though the forest itself was aware of her presence, weighing her intentions, deciding whether to let her pass. When she'd first read about the Merricks, she hadn't believed half of it. Generations erased by fire, an entire bloodline turned to ash in the same house, century after century. It was too perfectly tragic, too gothic to be true. But then there were the records, yellowed death certificates, newspaper clippings that described unexplained combustion and unnatural recurrence, and one grainy photograph showing the estate engulfed in flames, a lone figure standing at an upstairs window that no one could identify. That image had haunted her, the blur of a face framed by light, watching the house burn as though it were inevitable. That was why she came, to give the story a rational shape, to unearth history from legend. But as the forest closed around her, Clara began to wonder if some stories refused to be studied. The directions she followed were written in an uneven, almost childlike hand on yellowing stationery, unsigned and unstamped. She had found it slipped between the pages of a library ledger she'd borrowed, an archival document that should have contained only lists of names and dates. Instead, between Merrick, Thomas, died in 1842, and Merrick, Eleanor, died in 1924, the note had appeared. It read, "follow the road past the hollow until the air tastes of iron. You'll see the house when it wants to be seen." She'd laughed at first, thinking it a prank, but something in those words had lodged itself in her thoughts like a splinter. She told herself it was curiosity that made her go. But deep down, there was something else, a pull she couldn't quite name, an almost magnetic certainty that the house had been waiting for her. By the time she saw the outline of the estate through the trees, twilight had already begun its slow descent. The light was fading fast, staining the horizon in bruised colors. The mansion stood at the end of a clearing, a silhouette of decay and defiance. Its windows were black pits, its once white walls veined with soot. The air smelled faintly of smoke and damp wood, and beneath it, something metallic, like the tang of blood on cold iron. Clara stepped out of the car, her boots sinking into the wet earth, and the crunch of gravel beneath her feet echoed too loudly in the stillness. Every instinct in her body told her to leave, to turn back while she still could. But curiosity, pride, or something deeper kept her rooted. As she approached the gate, two iron doors rusted into a permanent half-open stance. She noticed the carvings along the bars. They weren't ornamental. Each panel bore a name, etched with deliberate precision, followed by dates. Merrick, 1771 to 1795. Merrick, 1802 to 1837. Merrick, 1842, 1871. A lineage of endings. The metal was cold beneath her fingers, and for a moment, she thought she felt the faintest vibration running through it, as if the gate itself was alive, remembering each death it had watched. She stepped through, and the temperature dropped instantly. The manor loomed before her, its roof sagging under years of neglect, ivy crawling up its sides like veins feeding something ancient. The front doors were slightly ajar, revealing a darkness that felt thicker than shadow. But it wasn't the building that made her heart pound, it was the stillness. Not silence, but stillness, as if the world around her had stopped moving, holding its breath for her next step. Even the forest behind her seemed to withdraw, its whispers fading into nothing. Inside, the air was heavy and stale, carrying the ghost of smoke long extinguished. Her flashlight cut a narrow path through the gloom, catching glimpses of broken furniture, fragments of portraits, and the remnants of a grand chandelier collapsed in a heap of glass and dust. Every corner seemed to hum faintly, an almost imperceptible vibration that made the hairs on her arms rise. She told herself it was the wind, but there was no wind here. Clara had studied architecture, and she could read buildings like maps of emotion, each crack, each repair a confession. The Merrick estate spoke of pride first, then isolation, then something much darker. There were scorch marks along the walls that no restoration effort had fully erased, as though the flames had left scars that refused to fade. Yet, amidst the ruin, some things remained untouched, a grandfather clock still ticking faintly though its face was cracked, a vase of withered flowers resting atop a piano covered in dust, and on the far wall, a painting that seemed to watch her as she moved. She approached the painting slowly. It was a landscape, Merrick Hollow itself, rendered in muted oils. But as she drew closer, she realized something strange. The forest in the painting was different. The trees were denser, the shadows deeper. And at the center, barely visible, was a figure standing on the same path she had just driven, staring toward a house that burned in the distance. The figure's posture was hauntingly familiar, the tilt of the head, the long coat, the notebook clutched in one hand. Her breath caught. The figure was her. She stepped back quickly, the beam of her flashlight trembling. It couldn't be. Her mind raced for rational explanations, an artist's coincidence, a trick of light, but even as she thought it, she knew the truth was older, more deliberate. Something here had been waiting, drawing her in inch by inch. The note, the forest, the directions, they weren't coincidences. The Merrick's history wasn't just a curse that repeated. It was a circle, a pattern of return. And now, she was part of it. Outside, the wind finally stirred, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke. The tree shivered. And from somewhere deep within the house, a floorboard creaked, not under the weight of memory, but of footsteps moving to greet her. The door to the portrait room was unlike any other in the house. While the rest of the estate had succumbed to rot and ruin, this one stood intact, sealed shut with a heavy chain that glinted faintly beneath years of grime. Clara discovered it on her second day in the house, after hours of exploring corridors that twisted into dead ends and staircases that led nowhere. The manor was labyrinthine, and she'd begun to suspect it had been built that way intentionally, to confuse, to conceal. Her flashlight flickered over the chain, and she noted the padlock's peculiar engraving, a sigil resembling an eye enclosed by flame. The same symbol had appeared on the spine of an old family Bible she found earlier in the study, its pages warped by heat. She traced the mark with her finger and felt an odd warmth radiate from the metal, as if the door were keeping something in, or something out. She spent the rest of the evening searching for a key, combing through drawers, trunks, and cabinets coated in dust. Every object she touched seemed to whisper of lives interrupted mid-motion, a child's shoe beneath a bed, a comb with strands of hair still caught between its teeth, a half-finished letter on a vanity that had burned around the edges before it was ever sent. The Merricks, she thought, had lived in cycles of interruption, their stories always ending in flames before they could reach their conclusions. It was as if time itself had conspired against them, cutting their lives short just as the ink dried. But the door called to her in a way the rest of the house did not. It was too deliberate, too preserved, as if it waited for someone who could see it not as ruin, but as a record. She eventually found the key in the most unlikely place, a child's toy chest hidden beneath a collapsed beam in one of the upstairs bedrooms. Inside were trinkets turned black with soot, a tin soldier missing a leg, a porcelain doll whose face had cracked down the middle, and at the very bottom, a small brass key shaped like a flame. It shouldn't have fit the lock, yet when she returned to the sealed door and slid it into the padlock, it clicked open with a softness that made her skin crawl. The chain slithered to the floor, the sound echoing through the corridor like the rattle of distant bones. She hesitated only a moment before pushing the door open. The smell hit her first, not decay, not dust, but something acrid, like the remnants of burnt oil. She raised her flashlight, and the beam swept across a room perfectly preserved and horribly wrong. The walls were lined with portraits, dozens of them, arranged from floor to ceiling, every inch covered in painted faces. The Merricks. Each generation, each expression immortalized in oils and brushstrokes that somehow felt alive. Yet every painting shared the same strange detail. The edges were blackened, scorched as if licked by fire that refused to consume them completely. Clara stepped closer, her heart drumming in her throat. The fire hadn't been random, it had chosen what to mark. She studied the faces carefully. The first portrait, a patriarch from the late 18th century, was painted in somber tones, his gaze stern and unyielding. His hands rested on the arm of a chair carved with the same sigil she'd seen on the lock. The scorch marks crept just to the edges of his frame, stopping short of his eyes, as if the fire had respected him, or feared him. The next portrait, a woman with copper hair and a pale, haunted expression, had been nearly obliterated by the burn, the flames curling inward until her face was half lost to smoke. And then there were the children, small, cherubic figures with eyes too knowing for their age, their features blurred not by time, but by heat. Each painting told the same silent story, beauty devoured, legacy consumed. In the far corner hung the most recent portraits, modern enough that she could identify them from the photographs she'd found in the archives. The last of the Merricks, Eleanor and her husband, Thomas, painted in 1923, a year before the final fire. These were the only two that seemed untouched by flame. Eleanor's portrait drew Clara in immediately. The woman's face was serene, but her eyes held something behind them, an unspoken plea or perhaps a warning. The longer Clara looked, the more she felt that the gaze was not fixed on her, but past her, as though the painted woman saw something moving in the shadows behind. Clara turned sharply, her flashlight sweeping over the room. Nothing moved. The air was still, but the silence had changed, it felt weighted, charged. When she turned back, she froze. The eyes in the painting seemed different now. The pupils had narrowed, focusing directly on her. She blinked hard, stepping closer to confirm what she'd seen, but the expression remained still, serene, unaltered. She told herself it was fatigue, a trick of her imagination. Yet the unease coiled deeper, rooting itself beneath her ribs. Her notebook slipped from her grasp, scattering papers across the wooden floor. As she knelt to gather them, she noticed something unusual. The floorboards beneath the portraits bore faint circular marks, blackened and cracked, as though the paintings had once been set aflame and then extinguished mid-burn. The scorch patterns radiated outward like petals of a dark flower, converging toward the center of the room where the ashes of something long destroyed lay in a shallow depression. She brushed at the ashes gently with her gloved hand and uncovered shards of glass, perhaps from frames, or from lanterns shattered in the heat of a past inferno. The deeper she looked, the stronger the smell of smoke became. It wasn't just old residue. It was fresh. She straightened quickly, scanning the walls again. A faint shimmer moved across the paint, so subtle it could have been the reflection of her flashlight, but it rippled through every canvas like a breath. Then she heard it, a faint, crackling sound, soft but unmistakable. It wasn't in the walls. It was coming from the portraits themselves. the sound of burning that never quite became fire. Her flashlight flickered again, the beam narrowing. For an instant, she thought she saw movement in Eleanor's painting, the faintest tilt of the head, the ghost of a smile that hadn't been there before. The air grew warmer, dry, almost suffocating. Clara took a step back, and the floor creaked beneath her, releasing a puff of dust that smelled of charred wood. In that suspended moment, she understood what the room was, a gallery of remembrance, but also of punishment. The fire never left the Merricks. It lingered, alive within their likenesses, bound to their images, waiting for someone to look too closely and let it breathe again. That night, the house began to make sounds it hadn't before. It started subtly, a whisper of shifting wood, a sigh that could have been wind through broken panes, but the Merrick estate had no windows left unshattered. Clara lay awake on the dust-choked couch in the parlor, her flashlight dim beside her, notebook open but untouched. She had spent the evening in the portrait room, unable to shake the feeling that the painted eyes still followed her even after she'd shut the door. The air inside the manor had grown heavier since then, thick with the scent of something singed. Every breath she took carried the faint taste of smoke, though no fire burned. She told herself the smell was trapped in the walls, a remnant of long-ago flames. But when she exhaled, she could swear the air came out colder than it went in. By midnight, she began to hear the crackling again. It was faint at first, like static seeping through the silence. Then came the whispering, thin, frayed voices rising and falling in rhythm, the kind that seemed to exist somewhere between thought and sound. She sat upright, holding her breath, listening. It wasn't imagination. The murmurs were real. They came from behind the old fireplace that dominated the far wall, the same one where soot had gathered so thick it looked like black velvet. Her pulse quickened. There was no chimney above, the roof had collapsed over that section decades ago. Whatever she heard wasn't the wind. She grabbed her flashlight and crossed the room, her footsteps muffled by the layer of ash underfoot. The whispering paused as if sensing her approach. She hesitated, the beam trembling slightly in her hand. The iron grate over the hearth was warped, melted in parts, as though it had been subjected to an impossible heat. She crouched down, feeling the cold radiating from it, not the chill of stone, but the deep, unnatural cold of absence. Her reflection stared back from the metal, ghostly and pale, her eyes flickering with the reflection of her own unsteady light. Then, quietly, unmistakably, the voice came again, her name, spoken like a memory. Clara! The sound was faint, muffled by layers of soot and brick, but it carried the weight of recognition. It wasn't the drawn-out moan of wind or the creak of timber. It was a voice, measured, intimate, and horribly near. She stumbled backward, her shoulder striking the corner of a collapsed bookcase, sending a rain of charred pages into the air. For a moment, she thought she saw something move in the rising dust, a shape forming out of the ashes before vanishing again. She blinked rapidly, forcing herself to think rationally. Houses had echoes. Sound traveled through old pipes, through cracks and hollows. She repeated this to herself like a prayer, but the voice came again, firmer this time. Clara! She shone her flashlight directly into the fireplace, and the light was swallowed whole. The darkness inside was too deep, too absolute. Her breath hitched. She leaned closer, careful not to touch the stone, and noticed something strange etched faintly into the soot, a mark that resembled a circle of thorns surrounding the same sigil she'd seen before, the eye within flame. The symbol seemed freshly drawn, lines sharp and glistening faintly as though inked in something wet. She reached toward it, not to touch but to trace its outline with the beam of her light. As she did, the air inside the hearth shifted. A low hum began, deep and resonant, almost like breathing. Then, from within that darkness, came the faintest flicker of orange. It wasn't fire, at least not at first. It pulsed faintly, rhythmic, as if something deep inside the wall glowed like a dying ember. The whispering swelled, overlapping voices now, layered in tones that rose and fell like a chorus. She couldn't make out the words, only fragments that brushed her ears with their closeness, return, bound, see, her body went rigid. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to leave the house and never come back. Yet she couldn't move. The voices had her anchored, each one brushing her thoughts like fingertips across the surface of water. Her flashlight flickered violently and died, plunging the room into blackness. For a moment, there was nothing, just her heartbeat and the soft hiss of unseen flames. Then, in the dark, she saw them. Shapes moving within the faint glow of the hearth, faces half-formed, their mouths open in soundless cries. They appeared not as ghosts but as impressions, shadows of people burned into the air itself. One of them, a woman with hair the color of copper, tilted her head as though seeing Clara clearly for the first time. Eleanor Merrick. The resemblance to her portrait was unmistakable, though here her expression was different. Pained. Pleading. "Why do you come back?" the voice whispered, no longer muffled. It filled the room as though spoken from every wall. Clara stumbled backward, her hand fumbling for her lighter. The tiny flame flared weakly, illuminating the space just enough to show the outlines of movement all around her, the shifting of light and shadow where no living thing stood. The voices continued, growing faster, overlapping until they became unbearable. She clapped her hands over her ears, but the sound wasn't entering through them, it was inside her, vibrating through her bones, echoing in the hollows of her chest. The heat rose suddenly, fierce and dry, though no visible fire burned. The smell of smoke thickened, acrid and ancient. She turned toward the door, but the air itself seemed to resist her movement, heavy and charged like the moment before a storm breaks. Then the whispers stopped. All at once. The silence that followed was suffocating. When she finally dared to look back at the fireplace, the glow had faded. Only the faint trace of that circle and eye symbol remained, smoldering faintly before cooling into darkness. The floor beneath her felt warm, pulsing almost imperceptibly beneath her feet. She took an unsteady breath and told herself she had imagined it, that the combination of exhaustion, fear, and stale air had conjured hallucinations. But even as she thought it, she heard a soft crack from the wall behind her, like the first splinter of wood catching flame. Her lighter went out, leaving her in absolute darkness. Somewhere deep inside the chimney, unseen and unreachable, a faint orange glow began again. She didn't need light to know what it was, the fire never truly died in this house. It just waited, listening, breathing with her. And in the thick silence that followed, she realized the whispers hadn't stopped at all. They had simply moved closer, slipping beneath her skin, curling their words in the back of her mind, waiting for her to answer. The discovery came 2 nights later, when sleep had long abandoned Clara and the house had settled into a rhythm of breathing that almost matched her own. She had begun to record everything, the sounds, the temperature changes, even the moments when she thought she saw movement in the corners of her vision. Her notes had grown frantic, scattered with half-sentences and sketches of symbols she found carved into the woodwork. The sigil of the eye in flame appeared everywhere, behind mirrors, inside drawers, burned faintly into the wallpaper as if branded there. It wasn't decorative. It was deliberate, a mark of belonging or of containment. That was when she began searching for the source, for the one who first drew it. And that was when she found Eleanor Merrick's diary. It was hidden inside the piano in the parlor, wedged behind the rusted strings that hadn't sung in decades. She had only been searching for something to occupy her hands, an object to ground her in the silence that had started to feel alive. When her fingers brushed against the book, she felt a tremor run through the wood, like a faint vibration. The diary was small, its cover blackened around the edges but miraculously intact. The initials *E.M. were pressed into the leather, barely visible beneath the soot. The pages inside were yellowed, the ink faded, but the words were still legible, and the writing was careful, precise, the kind of hand that belonged to someone who measured every thought before giving it form. The first entries were mundane, almost painfully ordinary. Eleanor wrote about the cold winters, the isolation, the way her husband Thomas had begun hearing voices in the walls. She wrote about the servants leaving one by one, about the townspeople who refused to come near the estate, and about the fires, small ones, inexplicable ones, that broke out without warning and extinguished themselves before doing real harm. She spoke of them not as accidents but as warnings, as messages that the house was remembering something it had once forgotten. Clara read deep into the night, her eyes burning, her pulse keeping time with the cadence of Eleanor's words. Then, about halfway through the diary, the tone shifted. The entries became fragmented, urgent. The handwriting grew uneven, the letters darker, pressed harder into the paper as if carved rather than written. Eleanor began to speak not of fear but of ritual. It began with the fire in the nursery. One entry read. The cradle burned though no candle had been lit. Thomas said he saw his reflection smiling in the window, but it wasn't his own face. Another entry followed, dated only 3 days later. The whispers no longer fade with daylight. They say the house must feed what it shelters. They say blood remembers what it owes. Clara turned the pages with trembling hands. The entries grew increasingly desperate, filled with descriptions of nights when the air glowed faintly red and the portraits on the walls seemed to shimmer with heat. Eleanor wrote of a ritual, binding the bloodline to its beginning, something she claimed would end the curse that had consumed every generation of Merricks. She described preparing for it in secret, collecting ashes from the hearth, mixing them with salt and oil, tracing the symbol of the eye and flame across the floor in front of the fireplace. Her words became incantations, fragments of prayer and plea tangled together. The fire must take one willing, she wrote, and one bound by birth. If the blood seals itself, the burning will end. If it does not, the circle will reopen. It always reopens. The later entries were nearly illegible, written in ink that had bled through the paper as if it too had been scorched. The final pages were spattered with something dark that might have been ash or dried blood. One passage caught Clara's breath completely. The circle is incomplete. The house remembers what I tried to bury. When the next of kin crosses the threshold, it will begin again. I cannot stop it, but perhaps she can. If she reads this, tell her the fire waits beneath her name. Clara stared at the words until they blurred. The next of kin. The phrase reverberated through her thoughts, impossible and yet undeniable. She had traced her own ancestry before coming here, curious about her connection to the Merricks, though the link was faint, a distant relative on her mother's side, a forgotten branch of the same family tree. She had dismissed it as coincidence, a curiosity for context. Now it felt like a noose tightening around her throat. The fires that had ended every generation were not random. They were the house's way of closing a loop, of binding each successor to its memory. And by stepping into the estate, she had continued the pattern. She turned back to the earlier entries, searching for any mention of how the ritual was performed or how it failed. One page described Eleanor drawing the circle around the fireplace, another mentioned a mirror placed at the center, a reflection meant to contain the flame. But the last entry ended mid-sentence, the ink trailing off the page. Beneath it, burned into the paper, was a faint handprint, small, delicate, unmistakably feminine. Clara touched it without thinking, and a sudden pulse of heat flared beneath her fingertips. The diary snapped shut on its own, as if the air around it had contracted. She stumbled backward, her breath catching. The piano behind her gave a low, mournful groan, one of its broken strings trembling on its own. The air grew heavier, and in that thickening quiet she could hear the faintest murmur, not in her ears but in her mind, the same voice that had whispered her name before. Only this time, it spoke clearly. Asterisk, you've read it. You've seen. Asterisk. Clara's flashlight flickered, the beam crawling toward the fireplace where the floorboards were darker than the rest, still marked by a circle of scorched wood. She could see the faint residue of salt in the grooves, remnants of a ritual half completed. A low hum rose from beneath the boards, the same vibration she'd felt when she first touched the diary. She realized then that the house wasn't haunted by its dead. It was haunted by its repetition, by a ritual that had never finished binding itself shut. The fire didn't destroy the Merricks. It preserved them, sealed them in a loop of their own making. She wanted to throw the diary into the hearth, to destroy it before it could speak again, but when she lifted it, the cover burned hot against her palms. She dropped it, and it landed open on the floor, the pages fluttering in a wind that shouldn't exist. The writing began to fade before her eyes, the ink turning to smoke, rising from the paper in thin curls. Then, as she watched, a new line appeared in the center of the page, fresh, wet, written in the same elegant hand, asterisk, welcome home, Clara Merrick. Asterisk. The fire began not with a spark, but with a breath. Clara felt it before she saw it, a sudden stillness in the air, followed by a warmth that spread across the floorboards like an unseen tide. The diary lay open where she had dropped it, its pages rippling though there was no wind. The words written there were fading one by one, erasing themselves in slow, deliberate strokes, as though the house had grown tired of her reading them. She took a step back, her eyes darting to the fireplace where the old circle of salt had begun to glow faintly, thin lines of ember tracing themselves through the dust. The heat grew in waves, pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat, and then came the sound, a deep, low exhale that seemed to rise from beneath the floor. The house was waking. Every instinct in her body screamed to leave. She grabbed her bag, her flashlight, and ran for the front door, but when she reached it, the handle refused to turn. It wasn't locked. It simply wouldn't move. The metal burned against her palm, forcing her to let go. The windows were no better, every pane of glass had gone opaque, covered in a thin film of blackish that seemed to shift when she looked at it. She tried calling out, though she didn't know for whom, her voice echoing strangely, swallowed by the vastness of the hall. The air trembled in response, like the house itself was breathing in her panic. Then the portraits began to whisper. It started faintly, a soft crackling sound, but as she turned toward the parlor, the murmurs grew distinct. Each painting flickered in the light of her trembling flashlight, their faces changing with every blink. The eyes followed her, lips parting in movements that mimicked words she could not fully hear. A warmth bled through the air, turning stifling, unbearable. She stumbled backward, and the light caught Eleanor Merrick's portrait at the end of the corridor. The woman's eyes were aflame, not metaphorically but literally, thin tongues of fire licking the painted irises. And yet her expression remained calm, even tender, as if she were watching a long-awaited event unfold. Clara ran. The hallway seemed longer now, stretching endlessly, the doors leading back into rooms she had already passed. The floorboards beneath her feet grew hot enough to sting through her shoes, smoke curling between the cracks. She coughed, her lungs filling with the dry taste of burning wood. Every turn brought her back toward the main hall, the same way a dream loops on itself. The fire wasn't chasing her, it was herded her, guiding her like a shepherd leading its flock. When she finally reached the base of the staircase, the air shimmered before her eyes. The entire house seemed to bend, its edges warping, ceilings lowering, walls closing in. The paintings along the stairwell wept soot. she caught sight of herself in a cracked mirror on the landing. Her face was pale, streaked with ash, her eyes wide and frantic, but behind her reflection, the flames had already begun to climb the walls. They moved without consuming, without spreading naturally, as if painting the world in light rather than burning it. Her reflection did not mirror her panic. It stood still, watching her calmly, lips parting in a slow, deliberate smile. She froze, unable to move, every muscle in her body caught in that impossible moment of recognition. The reflection tilted its head, and for the briefest instant, it wasn't her face anymore. It was Eleanor's. The shock broke her stillness. She turned away and stumbled toward the back of the house, her vision swimming in heat haze. The floor groaned under her weight, each step met with a sound like wood splintering under strain. She could hear the voices now, not whispers but distinct words, fragments of prayers, names, pleas, laughter. They came from the walls, from the ceiling, from the air itself. The Merricks were here, not as ghosts but as echoes of every fire that had ever consumed them. The house carried their ashes in its lungs. And now it was exhaling. She reached the kitchen just as the ceiling above gave a violent crack. Embers fell like sparks of rain, landing in her hair, on her sleeves. She slapped at them, but they didn't burn, they sank into the fabric, leaving trails of red light that spread outward like veins. The room was filling with a strange golden glow, thick and suffocating. She could see movement through the haze, silhouettes forming in the smoke, people walking through it, their outlines flickering like reflections in water. They passed through walls, through furniture, some turning their faces toward her as they drifted by. There were children among them, a man in formal dress, a woman clutching a candle whose flame burned blue. And then, behind them all, came Eleanor. Her apparition was clearer than the rest, as though the smoke itself gave her shape. She moved slowly, her eyes fixed on Clara. When she spoke, her voice was a whisper and a roar at once. "It has to end where it began," she said. "It needs one of us to finish the circle." The air shuddered, and the fire roared higher, licking at the walls, wrapping the room in light. Clara shook her head, backing away, but Eleanor only smiled, a sad, resigned curve of her lips that held no malice, only inevitability. "You shouldn't have come home," she murmured. The floor gave way with a sharp crack. Clara fell, crashing through the boards into the cellar below. The impact drove the air from her lungs, and she lay there gasping, staring up at the inferno spreading across the ceiling. The fire wasn't consuming the house in any natural way. It moved in patterns, tracing spirals and symbols that mirrored those in the diary. It wasn't destruction, it was completion. The flames gathered around the edges of the hole she'd fallen through, converging into a single, pulsing ring of light. At its center, the shape of the eye in flame emerged, brilliant and alive. The temperature climbed, the air trembling with the sound of countless voices merging into one. Clara could feel the pull deep within her chest, a strange sensation that was not pain but recognition. The fire had come for her, not to destroy her, but to claim her as part of the cycle, as it had claimed all the Merricks before her. Her reflection in the fragment of a broken mirror near her hand flickered once more. This time, it didn't move as she did. It simply smiled, serene and knowing, the face in the glass haloed by the fire's reflection. She looked up, her eyes filled with the brightness of it, and understood what Eleanor's last words in the diary had meant. The bloodline didn't end, it burned itself into eternity, sealed by flame, reborn each time someone with Merrick blood set foot inside the house. The fire was memory. It was inheritance. And now, as the flames reached for her, curling like hands, Clara felt the warmth close around her like an embrace. Upstairs, the portraits began to glow, their faces illuminated by the same infernal light, and in the reflection of every glass surface in the manor, she stood there still, unburned, smiling back from within the fire that would never die.